In the pre-dawn darkness of August 6, 1945, a lone American bomber lifted off from a tiny island in the Pacific. It was a machine unlike any other, a silver giant gleaming under the runway lights, pushed into the sky by 4 ferocious engines. Its name, painted just below the cockpit, was Enola Gay. This was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the most technologically advanced, expensive, and deadly weapon of the Second World War. Its target was the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Its payload was a single bomb, an atomic device of unimaginable power. In a few short hours, this plane would not just obliterate a city, it would incinerate the old world of conventional warfare and thrust humanity, blinking and terrified, into the atomic age. The B-29 was more than an airplane. It was the culmination of a nation's total industrial might, a marvel of engineering born from desperation, and a terrifying instrument of absolute destruction. To its crews, it was a temperamental beast, a sophisticated sanctuary in the sky that could become a fiery coffin in an instant. To the Japanese, it was a silver demon that brought death from altitudes they could not reach. This is the story of the plane that ended the Second World War. A story of a billion-dollar gamble, of catastrophic failures and brilliant innovations, of strategic genius and moral compromise. It is the story of the B-29 Superfortress, the ultimate weapon of the greatest generation. To understand the B-29, we must go back to the dark days after Pearl Harbor. The war in the Pacific was a conflict defined by geography, a war of tyrannical distances. America, reeling from the surprise attack, faced an empire that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. The workhorse bombers of the European theater, the rugged B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, were formidable weapons. But against Japan, they were shackled by their range. From the nearest available bases, they simply could not reach the industrial heart of the Japanese Empire. The strategic calculus was brutal. To defeat Japan, America had to bring the war to its home islands. This would require either a bloody, island-by-island invasion, projected to cost 1 million American casualties, or a new kind of weapon. A bomber that could fly farther, higher, and faster than anything before it. A weapon that could leapfrog the vast Pacific and strike at the heart of the enemy. The need was so urgent, the vision so ambitious, that in 1940, even before the United States entered the war, the Army Air Corps issued a staggering request. They asked for a superbomber, with a speed of 400 miles per hour, a range of over 5,000 miles, and the ability to carry a 2,000-pound bomb load halfway to its target. At the time, this was pure science fiction. No aircraft in existence came close to these specifications. It was a call for a quantum leap in aviation technology, a machine that would have to be invented, not just built. The challenge was met by the Boeing Aircraft Company. Their design, the Model 345, was revolutionary. To fly high above enemy fighters and flak, it would need a pressurized cabin, a feature previously found only in experimental aircraft. This would allow the crew to operate in a comfortable, sea-level environment while flying in the thin, frigid air above 30,000 feet. To defend itself, it would have a network of remote-controlled gun turrets, aimed by gunners using computerized sights from pressurized viewing blisters. This was a stunning innovation, a complex system of motors and analog computers that gave the B-29 unprecedented defensive firepower. And to achieve the required speed and range, it would be powered by the most powerful piston engines ever created, the Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone. The entire project was a monumental risk. The U.S. government, desperate for a war-winning weapon, took the unprecedented step of ordering 1,600 production models off the drawing board, before a single prototype had ever flown. This was the billion-dollar gamble. The total cost of the B-29 program would eventually swell to over $3 billion, nearly twice the cost of the Manhattan Project that developed the atomic bomb. It was the single most expensive weapons project of the entire war. If it failed, the American strategy in the Pacific might fail with it. The pressure on Boeing and the Army Air Forces was immense. They weren't just building a new plane, they were betting the war on it. Stepping inside a B-29 was like stepping into the future. It was an enormous aircraft, with a wingspan of 141 feet, longer than the entire first flight of the Wright brothers. The most revolutionary feature was the pressurized crew compartments. A long tunnel, just wide enough for a man to crawl through, connected the forward cockpit section with the mid-section where the gunners and radio operator worked. This allowed the crew to move between sections without depressurizing, a vital feature for long-duration missions. The pilots sat in a greenhouse cockpit that offered a panoramic view, surrounded by a dizzying array of dials, switches, and levers. They weren't just flying a plane, they were managing a complex system. The defensive armament was a work of genius. Gunners sat at comfortable stations, looking through optical sights. When they aimed, a central fire control computer calculated the lead, trajectory, and parallax for multiple turrets, which then swiveled and fired automatically. A single gunner could, in theory, control several turrets at once, concentrating fire on an attacking fighter. This system was so advanced that it terrified Japanese fighter pilots, who had never encountered a bomber that could shoot so accurately from such distances. The B-29 was a statement of technological superiority, a flying fortress redesigned for the vast emptiness of the Pacific. It was designed to be untouchable, a weapon that could strike with impunity from the stratosphere. But all this groundbreaking technology relied on one critical and deeply flawed component. The heart of the Superfortress was also its Achilles heel: the Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engine. Each of the four engines was a mechanical masterpiece, an 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial engine capable of producing 2,200 horsepower. But they were rushed into production. The immense power they generated created an equally immense amount of heat. The engines, tightly cowled for aerodynamics, were prone to catastrophic overheating, especially during the long, slow, high-power climbs to altitude. Crews quickly developed a dark gallows humor about their power plants. A common saying was that a B-29 had an engine fire for every day of the week. The magnesium used in the engine crankcase was particularly dangerous. If it ignited, it burned with a terrifying intensity that could melt through the wing spar in seconds, dooming the aircraft and its 11-man crew. Test flights were plagued by engine fires. The second XB-29 prototype crashed in Seattle in February 1943, killing Boeing's chief test pilot and his entire crew, after an engine fire spread to the wing. The disaster was a major blow to morale and the program's reputation. Throughout the early stages of its deployment, more B-29s were lost to engine failures, fires, and technical malfunctions than to enemy action. The crews flying these early missions were, in many ways, test pilots on the front lines, wrestling with a magnificent but deeply flawed machine. They were flying the most advanced bomber in the world, but every takeoff was an act of faith in four of the most unreliable engines ever built. The B-29's first taste of combat was one of the most ambitious and logistically challenging operations of the entire war: Operation Matterhorn. The plan was to base the bombers in India and fly them to forward airfields in China. From these Chinese bases, they would finally be within range of the Japanese home islands. The strategic concept was sound, but the execution was a nightmare. The forward bases in China were beyond the reach of Allied supply lines by land or sea. Every single drop of fuel, every bomb, every spare part, and every bullet had to be flown in from India by the B-29s themselves. The route was over the Himalayas, a treacherous passage known to pilots as the Hump. For every single combat mission a B-29 flew against Japan from China, it had to fly multiple cargo missions over the world's highest mountain range, battling extreme weather, treacherous downdrafts, and the constant threat of engine failure at high altitude. It was a terribly inefficient way to wage war. The logistical tail was wagging the strategic dog. The men of the XX Bomber Command were pushed to their limits, flying exhausting supply runs just for the chance to fly a single, grueling combat sortie. The pressure to produce results was enormous. The world was watching, and the billion-dollar gamble had to pay off. In June 1944, the B-29s finally flew their first mission against Japan, a raid on the Imperial Iron and Steel Works in Iwata. The results were a profound disappointment. The doctrine of the Army Air Forces was built on a simple, powerful idea: high altitude, daylight, precision bombing. The theory was that American bombers, protected by their heavy armament and flying in tight formations, could fight their way to a target in broad daylight and use the advanced Norden bombsight to drop bombs with pinpoint accuracy, destroying key industrial and military targets while minimizing civilian casualties. This strategy had worked, with mixed but eventual success, over Germany. It was expected to work over Japan. But Japan had a secret weapon that no one in the Allied command knew about: the jet stream. At the B-29's operating altitude of 30,000 feet, they encountered powerful, high-speed winds racing across the Pacific, sometimes exceeding 200 miles per hour. These winds were invisible, unpredictable, and devastatingly effective. They threw off the bomber's aim, making the Norden bombsight, a marvel of mechanical computing, almost useless. Bombs that were perfectly aimed were simply blown miles off target. Formations were shattered by the turbulence, leaving individual bombers vulnerable to the few Japanese fighters that could reach that altitude. Mission after mission returned with the same frustrating results: very few bombs on target, and little to no discernible impact on Japan's war production. Morale in the B-29 crews plummeted. They were risking their lives in a deeply flawed machine, flying thousands of miles on the world's most dangerous supply route, only to drop their bombs harmlessly into the Pacific Ocean or on residential neighborhoods. The superweapon was failing. The billion-dollar gamble was on the verge of becoming a billion-dollar bust. In Washington, patience was running out. In January 1945, a change was made. General Haywood Hansel, the commander of the B-29 force, a firm believer in high-altitude precision bombing, was replaced. His replacement was a man who would forever be linked with the B-29 in a new, more terrible form of warfare. His name was Major General Curtis LeMay. LeMay was the polar opposite of the gentlemanly Hansel. He was blunt, cigar-chomping, and relentlessly pragmatic. He had earned his reputation leading the B-17s over Germany, where he developed combat tactics that saved lives and destroyed targets. He was not an armchair general. He often flew the lead plane on dangerous missions to see the problems for himself. When LeMay arrived in the Marianas, where the B-29s had been relocated after the islands were captured, finally solving the logistical nightmare of the hump, he found a command in crisis. The results were still abysmal. LeMay analyzed the reconnaissance photos, studied the weather reports, and listened to the crew debriefs. He looked at the flimsy, wood and paper construction of Japanese cities. And he came to a cold, ruthless, and logical conclusion. The entire strategy was wrong. The technology, the altitude, the time of day, the targets, the bombs themselves, all of it had to change. He was about to make a decision that would transform the B-29 from an ineffective strategic weapon into the most destructive instrument of war the world had ever seen. The era of precision was over. The era of fire was about to begin. LeMay's new plan was radical, and to his crews, it sounded like suicide. He ordered them to stop bombing from 30,000 feet in the daytime. Instead, they would go in low, at night, between 5,000 and 7,000 feet. Flying low at night would neutralize the jet stream and dramatically improve bombing accuracy. It would also place them well within the range of Japanese anti-aircraft guns. Then came the most shocking order. To save weight and carry more bombs, he commanded that the B-29s be stripped of nearly all their defensive machine guns and ammunition. Only the tail guns would remain. The Superfortress, the plane designed as a high-altitude bastion of defensive firepower, would be flying low and nearly defenseless over the most heavily guarded cities in Japan. The crews were aghast. They felt they were being sent to their slaughter. Finally, LeMay changed the payload. Instead of high-explosive bombs intended for factories, the B-29s would now be loaded to capacity with M69 incendiary clusters. These were small, napalm-filled bomblets designed not to explode, but to spread fire. The targets were no longer specific factories, but entire cities. LeMay's gamble was that Japan's primitive night fighter defenses were ineffective, and that the sheer shock and devastation of a massive firebombing raid would cripple Japanese industry, which was largely decentralized in small, home-based workshops, and shatter the national will to fight. It was a devil's bargain. He was risking his fleet of priceless bombers and their crews on a single, terrifying roll of the dice. The target for the first test of this new tactic, Tokyo. On the night of March 9, 1945, the air over the Marianas thundered with the sound of 334 B-29s taking off, one after another, for Tokyo. They flew not in formation, but as a single stream of aircraft, navigating individually through the darkness. The lead Pathfinder planes arrived first, dropping their incendiaries in a large X over a densely populated working-class district. Then, the main force followed, their orders to simply bomb into the growing heart of the fire. The results were more horrific than even LeMay could have imagined. The M69s punched through the flimsy roofs of the wooden homes and spewed flaming napalm. Within minutes, thousands of small fires merged into a single, monstrous conflagration. A massive firestorm erupted, a meteorological event of its own making. Superheated air rose with such force that it created hurricane-force winds, sucking oxygen into its core and fanning the flames even higher. The winds were so violent they tossed the multi-ton B-29s around in the sky. The heat was so intense it boiled the water in the city's canals. The air crews could smell burning flesh thousands of feet in the air. For the people on the ground, it was a vision of hell. 16 square miles of Tokyo were utterly annihilated. The official death toll was estimated at 100,000 people, mostly civilians, killed in a single 6-hour period, more than were initially killed at either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was the single most destructive air raid in human history. The crews returned to the Marianas in a state of shock, their silver planes blackened with soot from the inferno below. LeMay had been right, his gamble had paid off, and the war in the Pacific had entered its most brutal and terrifying phase. The Great Tokyo Air Raid was not an isolated event. It was the beginning of a relentless and systematic campaign to burn Japan out of the war. With the blueprint for destruction now proven, LeMay's 21 Bomber Command unleashed its fleet of B-29s night after night. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, city after city was subjected to the same horrific treatment. The pattern was always the same. Pathfinders would mark the target area, and a stream of hundreds of bombers would follow, sowing fire and destruction. Over the next 5 months, the B-29s would fly thousands of sorties, dropping over 100,000 tons of incendiary bombs on more than 60 Japanese cities. The campaign erased a combined urban area larger than New York City from the map. Millions were left homeless, and the civilian death toll climbed into the hundreds of thousands. Japan's industrial capacity, much of which was housed in small workshops within these residential areas, was crippled. The moral line between military and civilian targets, already blurred throughout the war, was now effectively erased. This was total war, aimed at the infrastructure, the economy, and the morale of the entire Japanese nation. For the B-29 crews, the missions became a brutal routine. The fear of anti-aircraft fire was replaced by the horror of what they were witnessing below. They flew through the smoke and ash of the cities they had destroyed, their planes tossed by the thermal updrafts of the firestorms. They were instruments of a terrible new calculus of warfare, one that measured victory in square miles of ashes and smoke. Yet, despite the apocalyptic devastation, the Japanese government refused to surrender. While LeMay's firebombing campaign raged, another, even more secret project was nearing its conclusion. In the deserts of New Mexico, scientists of the Manhattan Project were in a race against time to build an atomic bomb. But building the bomb was only half the problem, they also had to deliver it. And from the beginning, there was only one aircraft in the Allied arsenal with the range, speed, and payload capacity to do the job, the B-29 Superfortress. But a standard B-29 couldn't carry the atomic weapons. The bombs, particularly the massive Fat Man plutonium device, were too large and heavy for the standard bomb bay. A special modification program, codenamed Silverplate, was initiated. A select group of B-29s were pulled from the production line and heavily modified. Their bomb bays were reconfigured, bomb doors strengthened, and all defensive armament, except for the tail guns, was removed to save weight. They were fitted with more fuel-efficient, fuel-injected engines and special electronic equipment for the unique mission. These were the most advanced and exclusive aircraft in the world. To fly them, the Army Air Forces needed a special unit. In late 1944, Colonel Paul W. Tibbets, Jr., one of the most experienced B-17 and B-29 pilots in the service, was chosen to command this new, top-secret group. It was designated the 509th Composite Group. Tibbets was given a blank check to select the best pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and ground crew he could find. They were sent to a remote airbase in Wendover, Utah, to begin their mysterious training, practicing dropping a single, heavy bomb from high altitude. None of them, not even Tibbets initially, knew the true nature of the weapon they were training to deliver. Life at Wendover Army Airfield was one of intense training and absolute secrecy. The men of the 509th Composite Group knew they were part of something special, but the specifics were a closely guarded secret. They practiced dropping large, concrete-filled dummy bombs, nicknamed pumpkins, to simulate the ballistics of the real weapons. They perfected a difficult and dangerous maneuver, a sharp 158-degree diving turn immediately after releasing the bomb. This was crucial, as Tibbets was told his plane needed to be at least 8 miles away from the target when the device detonated to survive the shockwave. The secrecy surrounding the 509th was absolute. The base was fenced off, and armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Mail was censored, and phone calls were monitored. The men were forbidden from discussing their training with anyone, including their families. This bred a sense of isolation and immense pressure. While the rest of the Air Force was fighting a war, the 509th was training for a single, hypothetical mission with a weapon they couldn't comprehend. In the spring of 1945, the group deployed to North Field on the island of Tinian in the Marianas. Tinian had been transformed into the largest and busiest airfield in the world, with 4 massive runways serving hundreds of B-29s. But the 509th was kept separate in a high-security compound. Their presence was a source of rumor and speculation among the other B-29 crews, who nicknamed them Tibbets, Folly, unsure what to make of this elite group that never seemed to fly actual combat missions. They were waiting for their weapon, and for the order from a new president, Harry S. Truman. By July 1945, all the pieces were in place on Tinian. The island had become the nexus of America's air war against Japan. It was a staggering feat of military engineering, a coral island scraped flat to create a city of runways, hardstands, and Quonset huts. For the men of the 509th, their small, guarded corner of this massive base was the center of the world. In mid-July, the cruiser USS Indianapolis arrived, delivering the final components of the uranium bomb, Little Boy. Shortly after, the components for the plutonium bomb, Fat Man, arrived by air. In specially constructed, air-conditioned buildings, the world's top scientists, who had designed the bombs in Los Alamos, now worked to assemble them. This was the Dragon's Lair, where the atomic beasts were being readied for their first flight. The tension was palpable. The Trinity test in the New Mexico desert on July 16 had been a success, proving the awesome power of the plutonium device. The Potsdam Declaration was issued, calling for Japan's unconditional surrender and warning of prompt and utter destruction if they refused. The Japanese government, dominated by a military faction that vowed to fight to the last man, woman, and child, ignored the ultimatum. The decision was made. President Truman gave the final authorization. The target list was finalized: Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagasaki. The mission was a go. On August 5, a B-29, which Paul Tibbets had named Enola Gay, after his mother, was towed to its loading pit. The bomb, Little Boy, was carefully hoisted into its belly. The plane was loaded with 7,000 gallons of fuel. It was time. At 2:45 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay roared down the runway at North Field, Tinian. Colonel Tibbets, at the controls, used every foot of the long runway, the heavily overloaded bomber lifting off just before the edge of the cliff that dropped to the Pacific. The flight to Japan was long and uneventful, a 6-hour journey through the darkness. The 12 men of the crew went about their duties with professional calm, though the weight of their unknown mission was immense. 2 other B-29s accompanied them, the Great Artiste, carrying scientific instruments to measure the blast, and an unnamed photographic plane, later named Necessary Evil. As they approached Japan, Navy Captain William D. Parsons, the mission's weaponeer, performed the final assembly of the bomb in the cramped, unpressurized bomb bay. It was a risky procedure, but considered safer than taking off with a fully armed atomic device. Over the city of Iwo Jima, they rendezvoused with their escort planes. The weather over the primary target, Hiroshima, was clear. Tibbets informed his crew, "It's Hiroshima." From 31,000 feet, the city was laid out below them in the morning sun. At 8:15 a.m. local time, the bombardier, Major Thomas Farabee, took control. Through his bomb sight, he centered the crosshairs on the WWII bridge, the aiming point. "Bomb away," he announced. The 9,700-pound little boy fell from the Enola Gay. The plane, suddenly lighter, lurched upwards. Tibbets immediately threw the B-29 into the violent 158-degree diving turn they had practiced relentlessly. They had 43 seconds. 43 seconds after release, at an altitude of 1,900 feet above Hiroshima, Little Boy detonated. The crew of the Enola Gay saw a brilliant, blinding flash of light, what co-pilot Captain Robert Lewis described as a peep into hell. Even though they were wearing protective goggles, the light was overwhelming. Then, two massive shockwaves, one direct and one reflected from the ground, slammed into the B-29, rattling it violently. The men thought they were taking flak. The tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Bob Caron, had the most direct view. He described a bubbling, boiling mass of purple-gray smoke that was rapidly climbing, and inside it, a core of red fire. A column of smoke ascended, forming the now iconic, terrifying mushroom cloud that rose to over 40,000 feet, towering above the altitude of the B-29. Below them, where a vibrant city of over 300,000 people had been just a minute before, there was now only a roiling cauldron of fire, dust, and smoke. An area of nearly 5 square miles was instantly and utterly devastated. An estimated 80,000 people were killed in the blast and the resulting firestorm. Tens of thousands more would die in the following weeks, months, and years from radiation sickness and other injuries. A stunned silence fell over the crew's intercom. It was co-pilot Robert Lewis who broke it, writing in his log, "My God, what have we done?" As the Enola Gay turned for the long flight home, the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima was visible for over 300 miles. A new and terrible chapter in human history had been written. The world reeled from the news of Hiroshima. President Truman announced the existence of the atomic bomb, again calling for Japan's surrender. But in Tokyo, the Japanese Supreme War Council was deadlocked. The hardline military faction argued that the Americans could not possibly have more than one such weapon and urged that the war continue, even if it meant the annihilation of the Japanese people. Their intransigence sealed the fate of another city. The second atomic mission was scheduled for August 11, but bad weather forecasts moved the date up to August 9. The B-29 chosen for this mission was Boxcar, commanded by Major Charles Sweeney. The target was the city of Kokura. The bomb was Fat Man, a more complex and powerful plutonium implosion device. The mission was plagued with problems from the start. A faulty fuel pump meant Boxcar couldn't access 600 gallons of fuel in one of its tanks. Then, at the rendezvous point, the photographic plane failed to appear. After circling for 40 minutes and burning precious fuel, Sweeney decided to proceed to Kokura alone. But when they arrived, the city was obscured by smoke and haze. After 3 frustrating bomb runs, with Japanese fighters now scrambling to intercept them and anti-aircraft guns opening up, Sweeney made a fateful decision. With fuel running critically low, he diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki. Arriving over Nagasaki, they found the city also covered by clouds. Just as they were about to abandon the run, the bombardier found a brief opening. At the last possible second, he dropped the bomb. Fat Man detonated over the Urakami Valley, destroying a large portion of the city's industrial heart and killing an estimated 40,000 people instantly. The destruction of a second city in 3 days with another atomic weapon, combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war on Japan on August 8, finally broke the stalemate in Tokyo. The Supreme War Council was still divided, but Emperor Hirohito, in an unprecedented move, intervened. He told his government that the war must end, that the Japanese people could not be asked to suffer any longer. On August 15, 1945, the people of Japan heard the voice of their emperor for the very first time. In a pre-recorded radio address, speaking in a formal, archaic Japanese that many could not easily understand, he announced the nation's surrender. He spoke of a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is, indeed, incalculable. The war was over. The role of the B-29 in forcing this conclusion is undeniable. The relentless firebombing campaign had already crippled the nation and killed hundreds of thousands, bringing the reality of the war home to the civilian population in the most brutal way imaginable. The atomic bombs provided the final, shocking punctuation mark. They were a terrifying demonstration of American power that gave the emperor and the peace faction within the Japanese government the leverage they needed to overcome the military die-hards and accept surrender. On September 2, 1945, on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the formal surrender documents were signed. The Second World War had finally ended. The B-29s, the planes that had brought fire and the atom to Japan, flew in a massive formation overhead, a final, silent testament to the air power that had helped bring the conflict to its devastating conclusion. With the end of World War II, most of America's vast war machine was dismantled. But the B-29 Superfortress was not retired. It was the only proven atomic delivery system in the world, and it became the cornerstone of the newly formed Strategic Air Command. As the wartime alliance with the Soviet Union dissolved into the icy standoff of the Cold War, the B-29 was America's primary nuclear deterrent. In 1948, during the Berlin blockade, B-29s were sent to bases in Britain, a clear signal to Stalin of American resolve. Although they weren't carrying atomic bombs at the time, their mere presence was a powerful strategic message. The Superfortress saw combat again in the Korean War. In the initial phases, they flew daylight precision raids against North Korean targets, but the arrival of the Soviet-built MiG-15 jet fighter made these missions extremely dangerous. The swept-wing MiGs could climb and dive on the propeller-driven B-29s with impunity. The Superfortress was forced to switch back to night bombing missions, much as it had over Japan. The aircraft was also adapted for a multitude of other roles. As the RB-29, it flew dangerous reconnaissance missions along the borders of the Soviet Union. As the WB-29, it served as a weatherbird, flying into the heart of typhoons and sampling the atmosphere for radiological evidence of Soviet nuclear tests. The B-29 Feat Key Bird crash-landed in Greenland on one such secret mission. The Superfortress was eventually replaced by its direct descendant, the B-50, and later the all-jet B-47 and B-52. But the B-29 had set the standard for the modern strategic bomber, creating a legacy that would define the Cold War. Today, only a handful of B-29s remain. Most have been lost to time, scrapped for their aluminum or left to decay in desert boneyards. Only two, Fifi and Doc, are still flying, maintained by dedicated volunteers as living monuments to a bygone era. They are magnificent machines, beautiful in their own terrible way. The legacy of the B-29 Superfortress is profoundly complex. It was a triumph of American engineering and industrial might, a machine that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. The men who designed, built, and flew it were patriots who performed their duty with courage and skill. The aircraft undoubtedly saved countless American lives by shortening the war and preventing a bloody invasion of Japan. But it was also an instrument of unimaginable destruction. The firebombing campaigns and the atomic missions it carried out raised profound moral questions that we still grapple with today. The Superfortress was a weapon that erased cities and targeted civilian populations on a scale never before seen. It was the plane that ended the last Great World War, but it did so by unleashing a new kind of terror on the world, a terror that would haunt the next half-century with the specter of nuclear annihilation. The story of the B-29 is a reminder that the tools of victory often carry a terrible cost, and that the line between hero and destroyer, between salvation and damnation, can be as thin as the silver skin of a bomber, flying high in the cold, unforgiving sky.